Okay, good morning, ladies, or afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you're from. My name is Michael McFadden, and I'm the supervisor of the Herpetofauna Department at Taronga Zoo in Sydney, Australia. There, my role is overseeing the reptile and amphibian department, as well as a number of ex-situ conservation programs, including those for the yellow-spotted bellfrog, which we'll talk about today, in addition to the northern crowberry frog, the southern crowberry frog, other frog species, and a few reptile species as well. So today we're going to talk about the yellow-spotted bellfrog conservation program. This is a species that we've been working on now for close to 10 years since its rediscovery, and we've only just started doing translocations over the last couple of years. So I'll cover a bit about the program as well as some of the translocations that we're undertaking at the moment. So firstly, the species, the yellow-spotted bellfrog, it's so named because of the yellow spots in its groin and thigh area. It's a fairly large frog, grows to about, I guess, 5 centimeters or 50 millimeters in length, and up to 70 or 80 millimeters in length. It's typically green and gold mottled, and they're closely related to a group of other endangered frogs in the bellfrog species group, including the southern bellfrog, which is very closely related to, and the green and golden bellfrog, which is another sister species. Both of these frogs are highly endangered, both found around southeastern Australia as well. Typically, they're found around permanent ponds with established aquatic vegetation, so they rely on ponds that are either still or very slow moving, with good aquatic vegetation, submergent veg inside the ponds for them to sit and cull from, and some good hiding shelter around the outside, including grassy patches. But these guys do rely on not being overshaded because they're mostly nocturnal, but they're a basking frog as well, so will occupy the side of the vegetation during the daytime. Now, the downfall of this species and a range of other species in Australia appears to be Chytrid fungus, and that's pretty much locked in now. In Australia, we first had Chytrid fungus arrive in what appears to be the mid-1970s, and it spread up and down the east coast of Australia about 100 kilometres a year after that time. So throughout the late 70s, throughout the 80s and the early 90s, we saw some pretty severe amphibian declines and crashes, and the disappearance of a number of species, including the gastric breeding frog, which you see there in the bottom left corner of the screen. Unfortunately, these days, both species of gastric breeding frog are only known from museum specimens. They were a unique frog that had the ability to swallow the eggs after they were fertilized, and their stomach enzymes would shut right down, and the stomach would act as a womb for the next 6 to 8 weeks while they developed through their tadpole stage to metamorphosis, and then were propulsively vomited up through their mouth to let go to little babies. But unfortunately, the two species went extinct in 81 and 85 as Chytrid moved through. Now, Chytrid's moved to every part of Australia it seems it's going to get to, everywhere that's climatically suitable. It's not throughout the deserts or across northern Australia because it simply gets too warm, whereas right down the east coast of Australia in the southwest corner has environments that are suitable for Chytrid, and Chytrid's already there now. And worldwide, of course, it's spread to everywhere except for Antarctica. It's impacting on a number of Australian species, so we've lost 6 species as far as we can see so far, and there's a number of other species, like the southern crowberry frog, which you will have heard about from Dr. David Hunter in his presentation, in the bottom right corner there. There's a number of species like that one that are now dependent on conservation, really intervention, human intervention for survival, because their numbers are so low or declining towards extinction, where insurance colonies followed by conservation research and translocation programs are necessary to keep these guys going. For the yellow-spotted bellfrog, it appears these guys disappeared due to Chytrid as well. So when Chytrid arrived, it moved through their habitat at the same time that these ones disappeared. They disappeared quite rapidly in the late 1970s. They were found through a good chunk of New South Wales. So on the slide that you see in front of you, the light grey parts of the slide is their predicted distribution, whereas those dot points around are where they were definitely known from. And where they were known, these guys were in really good numbers. But unfortunately, over a couple of year period, the species seem to have blipped out. Where they shared their habitat, they shared it with a couple of other potential Chytrid reservoir host species, including the Perrin's tree frog, Litoria perrini, the spotted marsh frog, and the common eastern froglet. All of these species are known to persist with Chytrid fungus. They don't seem to have any population level impacts. I say potential Chytrid reservoir host because in some areas they may be a reservoir host, same as, for example, the common eastern froglet. In areas where it occurs with the southern crowberry frog, these guys are an extremely high abundance of Chytrid infection rate, They're in high abundance, and their chytrid infection is over 90%. Almost all of them are infected with chytrid, and they carry it and show very little impact of it. They don't develop into disease. Whereas on the coast, then the numbers of infected animals are significantly lower. So this species was thought to have disappeared in about 1979. There's no records of it after that point. So this was one of those species that we thought was lost from Australia. We wouldn't be seen again. However, there was some good news with this program. In 2009, a DPI Fisheries Conservation Officer, Luke Pearce, was doing his surveys for southern pygmy perch along one of the creek lines he knows they're in, and he saw a green frog jump into the water. Unfortunately, he'd listened to a talk from Dr. Dave Hunter about a year earlier and was aware that bell frogs are diurnal basking frogs, and they've disappeared from that area. And after seeing that, he contacted Dave, and sure enough, the following year, as soon as the climate became suitable, they went out there and they found yellow spotted bell frogs, fully expecting to see one of the other bell frogs that had also disappeared from the tablelands, but was still persistent down in the lowlands. They rediscovered the yellow spotted bell frog. The population in this 3 to 4 kilometre stretch of rural creek line, you can see in the photo there, it's pretty degraded creek line. All the vegetation's taken down from right around the edges. There's very little trees. It's grazed by cows, sheep. The water level is degraded in parts, but there's a population of around 100 adult animals, so a little over 50 mature colony males on that stretch of creek line. So the initial steps after rediscovering that population was to establish an insurance colony. So as soon as we were able to get the permits and everything was suitable, Taronga with Dave Hunter went out there and collected an insurance colony with 16 mostly tadpoles and juvenile frogs developing from tadpoles over a 4-year period. To collect the initial individuals, we collected juveniles rather than adults because we wanted to minimise any potential impact of actually taking frogs out of that population. It was a fairly low population to start with, so we didn't want to have any impact on that. So we only collected the young ones, and we brought them back to Taronga and set them up in quarantine facilities. So all of the frog programs at Taronga Zoo are held in permanent quarantine, serviced first thing in the morning, and have dedicated equipment kept separately quarantined from all other animals. So in the photo there, it's one of the little guys, actually the first one we collected, little tadpole developing into a metamorphosing frog. At that time, or soon after, so the population was only discovered in 2009 and the first monitoring was undertaken, but unfortunately the population then began to decline. And it declined over a couple of years to the point where there was almost none left. And the reason for that is largely due to the La Nina weather pattern that we had. So with the La Nina, we typically get in Australia anyway, in the Sydney region, we get a lot of colder summer weather and more rain, which sounds like it could be perfect for frogs, but unfortunately, it's also perfect for chytrid. So at the site where we have the frogs, during the La Nina, we had heavy flooding events, which caused really high tadpole mortality. Unfortunately, the flooding events came at the worst possible time, at a time when almost all the frogs have bred already. The tadpoles were all in the stream, but unfortunately, they haven't metamorphosed. So as a result, the stream, which is usually a chain of still ponds, turned into a flowing torrent. And as a result, we didn't see any of the metamorphs come out from the stream, or very few. It seems that the result of the flooding events caused really high tadpole mortality, and that occurred concurrently with increased adult mortality due to chytrid fungus. Unfortunately for this basking frog, who almost relies on its being able to bask and elevate its body temperature just to keep chytrid at bay, 2 cold, wet summers with barely a day over 30 degrees Celsius resulted in higher than normal chytrid infection. As a result, the population crashed right down to the point where there was only a few frogs hanging on along that system. During that time of decline, the frogs at Taronga Zoo were maturing. We had, in 2011, when our first frogs reached maturity, we had a number of pairs named Plexus. We were attempting to breed them in facilities that we've had a lot of success with in the past with the green and golden bell frog. That's a species that we've had a conservation program for 20 or so years, and we have a lot of success breeding that species. At least 50% of our pairings produce eggs, and it's pretty reliable. However, unfortunately for these guys, we paired them up. We had amplexus across different frogs. The females didn't seem to have a lot of resources in them, and they seemed to have enough weight, but they didn't seem to be gravid and ready to go, and they didn't lay eggs. And in 2012, the same occurred again. And unfortunately, for a couple of years, there was no breeding success. So as a result of that, we had a container facility built just for these guys. So initially they were held in the quarantine room. Then we moved them to a frog facility that we established for these guys, which was set up utilising what we've done in the past for corroboree frogs and other species. All the lighting in the facility is controlled by a light sensitive switch, so it's controlled by photo period. It comes on of a morning when the light outside comes on. It's got refrigeration. You can see the large evaporator on the ceiling there. The reason for that, so we can cool them right down during the winter period to give them that overwinter cooling, because in the wild they do get down to around maybe 5-6 degrees Celsius, so we give them night coolings to that in winter time. We set it up with a variety of different tanks. So we've got smaller tanks in there and also some larger tanks for breeding in that facility too. So all the water through the facility is carbon and sediment filtered to take out some of the impurities. The facility's temperature controlled to try to replicate the wild environment as much as possible. We have UV basking lights above all the tanks to provide basking opportunities and good amounts of UV for the frogs. They're all given a diet of gut-loaded insects that have been calcium and multivitamin dusted. And we've provided a lot of shelter and areas for these guys to hide, just to make them as comfortable as possible for breeding. But unfortunately, after 2 years in this container, we lacked any breeding success as well. For some reason, these frogs weren't breeding as readily as their sister species, the green and golden bell frog. So we tried something a little bit different. We built a couple of suspended aviaries. The reason we built them suspended off the ground was for quarantine reasons. Previously, these guys had only been held in indoor facilities, so it was totally quarantined from any other species. But because of the lack of breeding success, and by this stage in the wild, I think we were down to maybe 2 remaining frogs, so the species was about to blip out again. We were desperate to get some breeding success, so we put them in these suspended aviaries. It's not shown in the photo, but we did put some large discs around the legs of the facility to prevent the incursion of frogs to be able to climb up on top of it. But these tanks had larger areas of water, UV lights in there, as well as only a third of the roof was sheltered. The rest of it allowed penetration of normal natural sunlight for normal UV basking, and also rainfall events. When it rained, the rain would reach the ponds inside those 2 aviaries to try to trigger breeding success too. We tried a number of other things, including automated callback playback to try to trigger males to call during the night and other techniques, but unfortunately these proved unsuccessful. We did have some calling males, but once again this proved to be, at this time, the only species at our entire zoo that were unable to breed in terms of amphibians at a desperate time that was required. So as a large ditch effort for this species, we built a larger aviary. And this large aviary, you can see in the photos, it's built out of it's colour bond material. We've got screen over the top. I've got a couple of shade sails that you can see inside the facility there. I've opened those out on really hot days, so we're getting days that are, I guess, reaching mid-30s to 40 degrees Celsius. We open those up just to provide a little bit of extra shade. But otherwise, there's plenty of opportunity for basking for the frogs in this facility. There's a larger pond of water. It's shallow at one end and it's deeper at the other, so that allows for a thermal gradient within the pond. The water's a lot warmer on the shallow part, especially during the daytime. We've got aquatic vegetation throughout the pond and a lot of vegetation around the outsides too. The water's filtered, carbon and sediment filtered, and it's got a UV sterilizer in there too. So we've set this all up as a larger facility, as a large ditch effort to get these guys breeding. And of course, plenty of oviposition sites for females. And we think that might have been one of the things that was stopping the breeding of these guys. As much as we provided the fake aquatic vegetation inside the other aviaries in the container facility, we didn't take real aquatic veg in, for the reason being, well, Chytrid risk or risk of other pathogens. We were trying to make it as sterile as possible, and it had worked fine in previous species, but unfortunately not for these guys. So in 2017, we had our first breeding success. It was the first time that this species was bred in captivity, and fortunately we had 2 large egg masses that were discovered in November 2017. When we discovered the egg masses, initially I thought they were infertile. They were totally white and unpigmented, which is not usual for a bell frog. But fortunately they proved me wrong. The following day they'd started to elongate, they started to grow, and sure enough, after a couple of days they were developing into little tadpoles. When they were getting to that stage, we actually removed a good chunk of the tadpoles, so about 80%, and we took them across to the shipping container facility that I showed in an earlier slide. We set them up in the shipping container facility, for the reason to keep a closer eye on them. In the pond, we can't really tell what's happening, and there could be aquatic insects in there that could predate on them and so forth. And we left about 20% behind to develop in the pond, just in case something went wrong in the transfer to the container. We wouldn't lose put all our eggs in one basket and lose them all. Fortunately, we did move most of them to the container. In the pond, we actually had very little success, and I believe aquatic insects in particular that have colonised in there did predate on some of the young tadpoles. In the container, though, we had a lot of success in terms of breeding, in terms of rearing them up through to maturity. And after 2 to 3 months rearing as a tadpole, we started getting metamorphs emerging around early to mid-February, and this provided ample opportunity to use offspring for reintroduction efforts. So we had a good number of frogs and tadpoles that were able to then utilise for our translocation efforts. I must say, we bred this species at that point. The species had once again disappeared from the wild, so they've been gone for about a year or so, 2 years at that point. So I guess it was critical that the Ex-situ program did succeed and did produce offspring for translocation. So then, now to talk mostly about translocations. In terms of translocations, for this species, we want to devise a successful translocation protocol. So come up with techniques that we can utilize to successfully guide the future reintroductions for this species and hopefully for other similar closely related species. There's a few things we're going to aim to do with our translocations. One of them is to determine the effective season of release. So whether or not getting them out there in spring or getting them out there in autumn provides a better outcome for the offspring post-release, and whether the size of metamorphosis has a big impact as well. We're going to look at suitability between 2 sites, and when I say we're going to look at, we're actually already undertaking this. I just haven't analysed the data just yet. We're going to look at the suitability of the 2 different sites for release, and also a study that we're going to be doing over the next season is looking at post-release dispersal microhabitat use as well. Now on the right part of that slide there, I've got our translocation proposal. In New South Wales, where we operate, that's the state in Australia that we operate, the requirements for undertaking translocations are that you have to complete a translocation proposal, which can be a good 20 to 30 page document, and it addresses all possible factors that could influence the translocation, including information about where the animals are coming from, their health history, genetic implications, as well as analysing the release site. So looking at what species are there, doing a bit of a risk assessment on what impacts releasing the species could have at that site, what impact it could have on the genetic implications, what the post-release monitoring protocol will be. It pretty much incorporates all that into one document to make sure that anyone undertaking translocations have really thought about all possible avenues or aspects of what could go wrong, and to consider everything that they should to help make the translocation successful. And after that point, it goes off to get scientific license. It gets reviewed by independent reviewers. You have to incorporate their comments. So it's like a peer review process before a scientific license will be given to actually undertake the translocation. So that's the process in New South Wales, hence popping up that slide just there. In March 2018, we undertook the first release of this species. So the first ones to come through. At that stage, they'd only been metamorph frogs for about a month or so. We undertook a translocation of 200 juvenile frogs in March, and then from that same cohort, we overwintered 200 juvenile frogs, and we released them at the same site in November 2018. All of them individually marked, and the purpose of the 2 releases of 200 frogs during each season was to have a look at the impact of the seasonal release on survival. So we want to know whether or not releasing in autumn or spring works better. Although the theory could be that a spring release works better, we don't know. A spring release would provide these animals long enough to, I guess, get adequate food before an overwinter period, long enough to establish where they live and potential shelter sites and so forth. But also coming out of winter into spring is when Chytrid seems to be higher in a lot of systems. So we really don't know what will be the best strategy for these frogs. Of course, from a resource perspective, the earlier that they go out, the less it costs. However, when it comes down to survival of a reintroduced frog, whatever technique works the best to get the most frogs surviving and the potential successful reintroduction will be the avenue that we go with. We expanded that to a second site as well. An additional 376 frogs were released at a second site in early December 2018. And this site was kind of a larger site as well. Both sites, to choose the translocation site, we incorporated a number of factors, including making sure the habitat is suitable for the species. one of the things we did was had a look at the sites to make sure they had the suitable grassy vegetation along the sides, enough potential for basking opportunities along the sides of the stream, as well as good submergent aquatic vegetation, because that seems to be a determining factor in where this species occupies habitat and where it breeds. Where there's not good aquatic or submergent vegetation, this species simply won't occupy that habitat or won't breed there. So that was one of the main determining factors looking at the habitat. And the first site where we released the 200 frogs in autumn and spring, that's actually a creek that leads into the creek that this frog was rediscovered upon. So the water parameters at that site may be suitable for this species to live with Chytrid, as it did for 30 years prior to its rediscovery. In the photos there, you can see one of the first frogs actually being released, and in the other photo there, you can see some of the key players in this program. On the left is Luke Pearce, the fisheries officer who rediscovered the species, myself in the middle, and Dr. Dave Hunter, the threatened species ecologist who coordinates this program, as well as, I believe, has already given 2 talks in this symposium so far. For post-release monitoring, for this species, it's primarily through nocturnal surveys. So they do bask, but getting up close to basking individuals of juveniles is particularly difficult. As they get to adult stage, this species is a lot more confident and will sit still, and you're able to approach it. But as juvenile frogs, they're a little bit more skittish, and when you get to close enough to approach them in the daytime, they tend to jump and hide pretty readily. So we do nocturnal monitoring, which is simply undertaking spotlight searches along the transect that the frogs have been released upon. So we undertake that by walking along, usually in teams of at least 2, along the transect, using spotlights to detect eye shine of the animal, either spotting individual animals sitting there or detecting their eye shine through use of powerful spotlights. We've undertaken this last season. All frogs that we recapture, we weigh, we measure, just so we can determine growth rates and body condition. We swab them for Chytrid fungus to see what impact Chytrid's having at the release site, and also we record their GPS coordinates so we can measure the dispersal rates. We undertook this monitoring this last season, so this last summer, which for us, we're just coming into our warmer period now. We're just exiting the cold period, as opposed to most of our, northern hemisphere listeners. But last summer for us, we had fairly low detection rates at one of our release sites, and unfortunately that's because Australia, especially Eastern Australia, is experiencing a severe drought at the moment, a really severe drought. So as a result, even the common frog species this last season were largely undetectable. There wasn't many getting out and about, so that has an impact on our initial translocation and numbers that we've been able to find. Hopefully that'll change this next season as throughout our translocations. Fortunately, last summer as well, despite the drought in the wild, we had a second successful breeding season at the zoo. We produced another 2 clutches of eggs, which resulted in 1,000 juvenile frogs being released to the second site. At that site, despite the drought and the water level has declined a little, there's still some good aquatic vegetation, and there's still good amounts of water, and the ponds are a lot larger, the creek's a lot wider. And you can see in the bottom photo there's a handful of frogs sitting around in the aquatic vegetation from the release. So fortunately, those frogs are being released too, and we'll be able to detect those this upcoming season. So in terms of our future plans for this species, it will be to continue the ongoing post-release monitoring. At both sites, we're looking at undertaking the nocturnal surveying for at least 6 to 8 surveys throughout the breeding season this year, detecting frogs by eye shine, as well as this season the males will be mature, so we'll be able to detect calling males as well, which is an additional way we can detect this frog. This season as well, we're looking to do something a little bit different. We're expanding to a 3rd site, largely because of the drought and because of habitat becoming unsuitable at other sites. We're expanding to a 3rd site that has really good levels of water, really good aquatic vegetation. It's been rehabilitated quite well, so it provides what we can see as the perfect habitat for bell frogs. Of course, what we can't determine is what impact Chytrid will have at that site. That's something that there are other frog species there, but this frog and other bell frogs seem to be able to persist at some sites where the habitat is great with other species. So we're hoping that we'll have some success at that site, but to be able to monitor that a little bit more closely, we're going to do a radio tracking study with frogs as well. So this season we'll be radio tracking 20 frogs with little mini waste belts and put them out on the stream, and we'll be having a look at their post-release dispersal, so monitoring daily how far their movements are, whether they move from the release site, how far back from the creek they actually move. We'll measure what microhabitat use what microhabitat they're using for shelter and foraging. We'll be tracking chytrid infection each week on each of the 20 frogs to determine when and if they become infected with chytrid fungus. And we'll be looking at, I guess, their eventual fate, whether or not we release them and all 20 frogs are surviving in 3 months' time when we complete the radio tracking work, or whether or not they've all been infected with chytrid or eaten by snakes. Whichever way it happens, it'll really guide the reintroduction program. So with any translocation program, post-release monitoring is absolutely essential to work out exactly what's happening with the frogs post-release. Otherwise, loads of resources can be put into programs where we really don't know what's happening with the frogs. So this season we'll be closely tracking those frogs just to determine exactly what happens, and then from understanding that a little bit better, it kind of guides your translocation efforts. It guides how you attack the following season, what changes you make to ensure whatever has impacted on them in the past doesn't impact them in the current future years. If it's to do with chytrid, we might be able to mitigate chytrid in some way through environmental manipulation, whether it be increasing the warmth of ponds, providing a greater metapopulation structure by dams offset from the creek. It could be by creating, maybe not for this species, but for other species, taking out some of the canopy to increase the temperature down at the creek level. So there's things you can do there to some degree. If it's due to predators, if it's due to inadequate shelter sites along the creek, we might be able to select better release sites that have more adequate shelter selection and so forth. So this season, through tracking the frogs as well as our post-release monitoring at the other 2 sites, we'll be able to track the individuals and their body condition and their survival rates. We'll have a better idea of how to, I guess, preserve this species in the future long term, and hopefully establish populations of these in the wild. Now, there's my acknowledgements. There's a number of partners that have contributed to this, including what was formerly the Office of Environment Heritage, is now Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, as well as Taronga Zoo, and our university and other government partners. I would field questions about now, guys, and I believe that's what's happening on the other talks, but unfortunately I've pre-recorded this one. At the time you're hearing this, I'll be in the car driving somewhere across Arizona. So unfortunately I can't answer questions on this occasion. However, if you do have any questions for me, by all means, I am contactable. I think my email details will be there with the rest of the presenters on these talks. I'll have an abstract in there as well. But by all means, feel free to contact me if you'd like to know any more about the program, or in fact some of the other programs we're working on, including those for corroboree frogs and other species. Okay guys, thanks for listening to this program, and I hope you enjoyed the seminar series.